They say that a family is a beautiful tapestry built on love and shared history, but they never warn you about the threads that cut deeply into your own bare hands. I am 35 years old. I stood in my kitchen on a Sunday afternoon, completely surrounded by the heavy, thick scent of roasting rosemary and garlic. The late afternoon sun filtered gently through the wooden blinds, casting long, deliberate shadows across the cold granite countertops. I had been awake standing on these hardwood floors since 5 o'clock in the morning. I was preparing a highly complicated, slow-roasted standing rib roast simply because it was the absolute favorite meal of my husband, David. I chopped yellow onions until my eyes watered. I peeled russet potatoes until my fingers cramped. I carefully measured out exact portions of sifted flour and salted butter to make a perfect rich gravy. My hands moved mechanically, following a rhythm born of pure necessity. This is exactly what I did every single month, desperately trying to keep the fragile peace. David is a fundamentally good man. He works incredibly long hours as a senior partner at a local engineering firm. He loves his family deeply, but he has a blind spot, a massive, glaring, destructive blind spot, and her name is Clara. Clara is his older sister. She is 42 years old. She walks into rooms as if she personally owns them, and everyone else is just visiting on her good graces. Today was the designated monthly family dinner. I was completely determined to make it flawless. I wiped my damp brow with the back of my flour-covered hand. The digital oven timer ticked softly but persistently in the otherwise quiet kitchen. David walked in casually, adjusting the collar of his shirt. "It smells absolutely amazing in here," he said, smiling brightly. He walked over and kissed the top of my head. I smiled back at him, a tight, heavily practiced smile. I desperately wanted to tell him that my lower back ached terribly. I wanted to tell him that I was bone-tired from carrying the mental load of this entire weekend. But I swallowed the heavy words. I always swallowed the words, pushing them down to maintain the harmony. The loud doorbell rang, suddenly echoing through the long front hallway. "She is finally here," David said, his voice dropping slightly, losing a bit of its cheer. I wiped my hands clean on my white apron. I took a deep, steadying breath, filling my lungs. I walked slowly behind David toward the heavy front door. He opened it wide. Clara stood on the porch holding a bottle of shockingly cheap wine, wearing a completely unbothered expression. She was exactly 45 minutes late. She did not offer a single apology. She simply brushed past David, stepping straight into the foyer. She shoved the warm bottle of wine directly toward me without even looking at my face. "Put this in the refrigerator immediately," she commanded, as if speaking to a hired hand. "It desperately needs to chill." I quietly took the green bottle. I walked back into the safety of the kitchen. Clara followed close behind me, thoroughly inspecting the house exactly as she always did. She ran an assessing finger over the polished edge of the dining table. I watched her every move from behind the large kitchen island. She sighed loudly and dramatically. "It smells a bit heavy and greasy in here," she remarked, waving her hand. "Have you ever considered opening a window to let out the smoke?" I turned my back to her, facing the hot stove. The brown gravy was bubbling softly. I stirred it slowly and rhythmically. Clara leaned heavily against the marble counter. She watched me work with a deeply critical eye. So she began, her tone laced with false sweetness. "Are you still working at that little community nonprofit job?" She emphasized the word little in a way that made my chest tighten painfully. "I am the regional director of community outreach," I replied calmly, fighting to keep my voice perfectly steady. "It is very fulfilling and important work." Clara let out a short, sharp, dismissive laugh. I suppose it keeps you busy and out of trouble, she said, tilting her head. But David works so incredibly hard to provide for this beautiful, expensive house. It is a terrible shame you do not contribute more financially and practically. The wooden spoon stopped moving entirely in the hot gravy. I stared blankly at the dark brown liquid. I felt a sudden intense prickling heat building behind my eyes. I possessed a master's degree. I worked 50 demanding hours a week. I managed every single exhausting aspect of this household. I single-handedly organized these elaborate family dinners. I bought all the holiday gifts. I remembered all the important birthdays. And yet to her viewing eyes, I was nothing more than a lazy hobbyist living comfortably off her brother. I waited silently for David to finally say something. I waited for him to firmly defend my career and my honor. I waited for him to look his sister in the eye and tell her that she was crossing a serious line. I slowly looked up from the stove. David was standing by the large refrigerator. He was looking down directly at his glowing phone. He had heard her exact words. I knew for a fact he had heard her, but he did not look up. He did not say a single defensive word. He simply swiped his thumb across the bright screen, actively pretending to be entirely occupied. The silence in the kitchen grew instantly heavy. It pressed down on my shoulders like a real physical weight. I realized in that exact crystal clear moment the true devastating extent of my complete invisibility in this family. Clara smiled at me, a thin, deeply satisfied smile. "Well," she said briskly, "I am going to use the restroom to freshen up. Do try hard not to burn the expensive roast." She turned sharply and walked confidently out of the kitchen. I stood perfectly still, gripping the wooden spoon. I absolutely did not cry. I was entirely too exhausted to shed a single tear. I just looked at David. He finally pocketed his phone, looking up at me. He offered me a weak, pathetic, apologetic shrug. "That is just exactly how she is," he muttered softly. "You know, you just have to ignore her moods." He quickly walked away, eagerly following his sister into the comfortable living room. I was left completely alone, standing with the boiling pots and the relentless ticking timer. I focused my eyes on the bubbling brown gravy. I breathed in slowly, counting to 10, letting the hot steam warm my cold face. I carefully plated the thick slices of perfectly cooked rib roast. I carried the heavy ceramic platters into the formal dining room one by one. I set the table carefully, making sure the silver forks were perfectly aligned. I poured the chilled red wine into the delicate crystal glasses. I smiled politely as we all sat down together at the large table. The dinner conversation flowed mostly around David and his demanding engineering projects. Clara asked him detailed questions about his recent promotions. She practically beamed with pride whenever he spoke. I passed the buttery mashed potatoes. I refilled the empty water glasses. I listened quietly, offering a nod or a soft hum whenever appropriate. I swallowed my pride along with every bite of the tender meat. I kept the fragile piece exactly as I always did. As they talked, my mind drifted back over the last 4 entire years. I thought about our elegant outdoor wedding reception. I remembered how Clara, wearing a shockingly bright white dress, had loudly complained about the floral arrangements to anyone who would listen. I remembered our first Thanksgiving as a married couple. I had spent 3 full days preparing a massive traditional feast. Clara had taken one single bite of my homemade stuffing. She had pushed her plate away, sighing deeply, and declared it entirely too dry for human consumption. I thought about the time I was promoted to regional director. I was incredibly proud of the hard-earned achievement. We had invited his family over to celebrate the good news. Clara had arrived with a small wilted houseplant. She handed it to me carelessly. "It is nice you have a little hobby," she had said smoothly while David stood right next to her, completely silent. 4 entire years of these tiny, sharp paper cuts. 4 years of swallowing my immediate angry reactions. 4 years of telling myself over and over again that it was simply not worth a massive argument. I had convinced myself foolishly that being the bigger person was the right thing to do. I had believed truly and deeply that my endless patience would eventually soften her hard edges. I thought my absolute kindness would eventually win her basic respect. Instead, my complete silence had only emboldened her. My constant quiet suffering had become the absolute standard of our entire family dynamic. David had grown completely accustomed to my seamless role as the emotional buffer. He relied heavily on me to absorb the sharp shocks of his older sister. He never had to confront her because I always smoothed things over before the tension could ever explode. I looked across the candlelit table at my handsome husband. He was laughing warmly at a long joke Clara had just finished telling. He looked so incredibly relaxed, so completely at ease in his own dining room. He did not notice my rigid posture. He did not see the exhausted dark circles under my tired eyes. He was completely blind to the heavy emotional toll this evening was actively taking on me. Clara reached across the wide table, taking the last dinner roll without asking. "The roast was surprisingly decent," she remarked casually, examining the bread. Although, she added sharply, it could have used a bit more salt in the thick crust. I looked at the empty serving platter. I looked at her entirely unbothered face. "Thank you, Clara," I said quietly, my voice completely devoid of emotion. "I am so glad you found it acceptable." I stood up slowly from the wooden chair. I began to gather the dirty porcelain plates. I stacked them methodically, focusing entirely on the smooth ceramic surfaces. I carried the heavy stack back into the messy kitchen. I set them down softly by the stainless steel sink. I stared out the dark window into the black night. I turned the silver faucet on, letting the hot water rush over the dirty plates. The thick grease washed away quickly, swirling down the dark drain. I did not say a single word. I just kept washing the endless pile of dirty dishes. I watched him walk away back into the bright living room. The heavy wooden door swung shut, leaving me entirely alone with the sudsy water. The warm water ran slowly over my cold hands, softening my tired skin. I looked down gently at the messy piles of greasy plates and the heavily stained roasting pan. It would take me at least an entire hour to scrub everything perfectly clean. I had always done this hard work every single month without a single complaint. I had believed truly and deeply that real love meant carrying the heaviest loads in complete silence. I reached out slowly and turned off the silver faucet. The sudden silence in the kitchen was surprisingly deafening. I stood perfectly still, listening to the muffled sounds of loud laughter from the living room. They were laughing together, completely unbothered by the mess, while I stood here physically aching. A quiet realization, slow and incredibly clear, washed over my tired mind. I was entirely responsible for my own deep emotional misery. I had trained them carefully over the last 4 years to expect my endless silent servitude. I had built this suffocating family system with my own 2 hands. I asked myself quietly, standing in the fading light, if I was the strong glue holding this fragile family together, what would actually happen if I simply decided to let go? I looked intently at the heavy roasting pan, deeply caked with burnt grease. I usually scrubbed it hard until my shoulders burned with pain to ensure David woke up to a completely spotless kitchen. But tonight, a strange, profound calm settled heavily over my aching chest. I did not feel angry at him. I did not feel vindictive toward her. I just felt completely and utterly finished with the entire routine. I reached over quietly for a clean cotton towel. I dried my wet hands slowly and deliberately, finger by finger. I folded the white towel neatly, placing it carefully on the edge of the marble counter. I decided firmly in that exact quiet moment that I was officially done. I was done planning these massive, elaborate monthly dinners that completely exhausted my spirit. I was done swallowing my own clear voice to protect the fragile feelings of a husband who absolutely would not protect mine. I was done acting gracefully as the soft human shield between David and the incredibly sharp edges of his own difficult sister. From this moment forward, I would simply step back into the shadows. I would let David completely manage his own complicated family. I would let Clara directly experience the natural consequences of her deeply bitter attitude. I would no longer bend over backward to constantly overcompensate for their glaring emotional deficits. If the carefully curated fragile piece finally broke, it would break entirely openly for everyone in the house to finally see. I untied the strings of the white apron from around my aching waist. I draped the stained fabric casually over the high back of a tall wooden stool. I reached for the wall switch and turned off the harsh overhead lights. I plunged the messy, chaotic kitchen into cool, deep shadows. I left the dirty porcelain plates sitting exactly where they were, soaking in the cold water. I walked away quietly, leaving the heavy burden behind me on the wet granite counter. I stepped softly onto the back porch, breathing in the crisp night air, feeling strangely lighter than I had in 4 years. The bright morning sun streamed through the kitchen window, hitting the large paper calendar pinned to the silver refrigerator door. It was a Tuesday morning, exactly 2 days after the disastrous heavy dinner. David sat comfortably at the small wooden table, rapidly scrolling through his work emails, drinking his hot black coffee. I stood across the room at the granite counter, packing my simple lunch, watching him carefully. Right there on the glossy paper calendar, a large red circle marked Friday. It was the 43rd birthday of his older sister, Clara. In any other normal year, this exact week would be filled with frantic, stressful activity for me. I would have already purchased a thoughtful, expensive gift using our joint credit card. I would have bought a beautiful, thick card and left it prominently on the kitchen island with a blue pen resting right on top of it. I would have gently reminded David every single morning to please sign his name before he rushed out the door to his busy office. And then on the actual day, I would have driven completely across town to deliver the wrapped package, enduring whatever sour mood Clara happened to be in that afternoon. I looked at David holding his warm ceramic mug. He rubbed his tired eyes, sighing heavily about a new project deadline. They moved the major presentation up to Thursday, he complained loudly, tapping his index finger on the wooden table. I am going to be completely buried in spreadsheets for the next 3 solid days. I listened to his familiar complaints, nodding my head sympathetically. I felt the old, deeply ingrained habit rising up strongly in my tight throat. The familiar words were right there, resting heavily on the tip of my tongue. Do not forget David. I almost said automatically that Friday is the birthday of Clara, so please call her early in the morning. I actually opened my mouth to speak the helpful warning. But then I remembered the heavy, burnt roasting pan soaking endlessly in the cold sink. I remembered his complete deafening silence while his sister insulted my career in my own warm kitchen. I slowly closed my mouth, pressing my lips together in a firm, tight line. I swallowed the helpful reminder, pushing it deeply down into the dark, quiet space where I kept all my unsaid words. That sounds like a very stressful week, I said calmly, pouring myself a fresh cup of hot coffee. You should make sure to get plenty of rest when you come home tonight. David nodded absently, completely unaware of the massive invisible shift that had just occurred in our marriage. He finished his hot coffee in one long gulp. He grabbed his leather briefcase from the floor and kissed my cheek briefly. "I will see you tonight," he said quickly, rushing out the heavy front door without looking back. I stood alone in the quiet morning kitchen. I looked at the red circle on the hanging paper calendar glaring at me brightly. A small wave of guilt washed over my stomach, making me feel slightly nauseous. I was a deeply organized person who prided myself on taking excellent care of my family. Dropping the ball intentionally felt incredibly unnatural and deeply uncomfortable to my core. My mind raced quickly with anxious, panicked thoughts. He is going to be so angry with himself when he eventually realizes he completely forgot. Clara is going to be absolutely furious, and she will definitely blame me for not reminding him properly. I took a deep, shaky breath, gripping the edge of the cool counter. I reminded myself firmly that David was a highly educated 40-year-old man. He managed a massive team of talented engineers at a major corporate firm. He tracked million-dollar budgets and highly complex project timelines with absolute ease. He was entirely capable of remembering the birth date of his own biological sister. The only reason he never remembered was because I had never ever allowed him to forget. I had happily served as his external memory drive for the last 4 entire years. I turned away deliberately from the bright calendar. I picked up my packed lunch and my heavy work bag. Wednesday evening arrived, bringing a heavy, quiet tension to the living room. David sat comfortably on the soft sofa, scrolling endlessly through his phone. I watched him open his social media app right in front of me. I knew for a fact that Clara loved to post early, elaborate hints about her upcoming birthday week. David stared right at the glowing screen, his thumbs swiping steadily, his expression completely blank. He did not process the obvious information. Thursday night arrived, marking the absolute eve of the looming disaster. I prepared a very simple, fast dinner, boiling dry pasta and heating up a jar of basic red sauce. "Do you have any special plans for tomorrow afternoon?" I asked casually, keeping my voice incredibly light and completely neutral. I was handing him a perfectly clear, wide-open opportunity to finally remember on his own. He shook his head slowly, reaching across the table for a glass of cold water. "No plans at all," he replied exhaustedly, rubbing his tense neck. "Maybe we can just order a large pizza and watch a good movie," he suggested warmly. "That sounds like a very nice, quiet evening," I finally replied, wrapping my hands around my own glass, waiting quietly for Friday to begin. Friday morning dawned completely ordinary and bright. The cheerful birds chirped loudly outside our large bedroom window. David woke up early, entirely focused on his major corporate presentation. He tied his silk blue tie quickly and sharply, staring blankly into the bathroom mirror. He grabbed his heavy leather briefcase, kissed my forehead lightly, and walked out the front door. He did not glance at the paper calendar. He did not pause to think about the specific date. I stood quietly in the warm kitchen, listening to his car engine fade away down the quiet suburban street. A heavy, anxious knot formed tightly in my stomach. The entire day dragged by slowly and painfully. I drove to my own office, navigating the busy morning traffic. I sat at my wooden desk reviewing large budget reports. Every single time my cell phone vibrated, I jumped slightly in my chair. I fully expected an angry text message or a demanding phone call, but the screen remained completely quiet. At 5 o'clock, I packed my heavy work bags. I drove back to our quiet neighborhood, feeling a strange mix of deep dread and quiet vindication. David arrived home at exactly 6:30 in the evening. He looked completely exhausted but visibly relieved. "The massive project is finally approved," he announced loudly, dropping his bags near the entryway. The difficult presentation went perfectly, and the clients were thrilled. He loosened his silk tie, breathing a heavy sigh of pure relief. "Let us order that large pizza," he said with a wide, genuine smile. I nodded slowly, dialing the familiar number of our favorite local Italian restaurant. We sat comfortably on the soft gray sofa, watching a meaningless comedy on the television. The warm smell of baked dough and melted cheese filled the cozy living room. Everything felt completely normal, wonderfully domestic, and entirely safe. At exactly 8:15, the fragile illusion shattered completely. His cell phone rang loudly and sharply, cutting through the quiet laughter of the television show. The bright screen flashed, illuminating the dark coffee table, clearly showing the name of his older sister. David picked it up casually, not suspecting a single thing. "Hello, Clara," he said warmly, leaning back heavily against the soft cushions. A sharp, piercing voice instantly echoed from the tiny speaker. I could hear her angry, elevated tone from entirely across the room. "Did you seriously forget what specific day it is?" she demanded sharply, without a single polite greeting. David froze completely, his entire body going incredibly rigid. His dark eyes widened in sudden, sheer, unadulterated panic. He looked desperately at me, sitting completely still on the opposite end of the long sofa. He mouthed the single word "birthday," his tired face turning entirely pale. The warm blood drained completely from his cheeks. I just looked back at him, holding a warm slice of pepperoni pizza. I did not nod my head. I did not offer a single comforting smile. I simply maintained direct eye contact, completely neutral and calm. "I am sitting here waiting," Clara continued loudly, her voice trembling with deep theatrical indignation. "I waited all day long for a simple phone call or a basic text message. Our mother called me at 9 in the morning. Even our distant cousins in Ohio remembered to reach out early. But my very own brother completely ignored me on my special day." David stammered quickly, desperately trying to formulate a weak, plausible excuse. "I am so incredibly sorry, Clara," he pleaded frantically, rubbing his tense forehead. "I was completely buried in a massive project at work today, and I just entirely lost track of the hours." "Work is absolutely not a valid excuse," she snapped back bitterly, her loud voice dripping with pure venom. "Could Sarah not be bothered to remind you properly? Could she not even manage to pick out a simple greeting card or send a decent floral arrangement?" I knew she was deeply resentful about my minor comments at dinner on Sunday, but this is incredibly petty and completely vindictive of her. David looked at me again, the sheer panic in his eyes slowly replaced by deep, utter confusion. He actually expected me to jump in immediately and save him from her wrath. He held the phone out slightly directly toward me, hoping I would take the blame exactly as I always did. He wanted me to apologize to smooth over his own careless mistake and restore the peace. I simply placed my warm slice of pizza gently down on the paper plate. I picked up my tall glass of cold water, took a slow, deliberate sip, and looked completely away, staring blankly at the bright television screen. David stared at me in complete disbelief as I completely ignored his silent plea. He brought the dark phone back to his own ear. "I am so sorry, Clara," he repeated weakly, sounding exactly like a scolded child. "I will make it up to you. I promise you that." He listened to her complain bitterly for another 10 excruciating minutes before she finally hung up the loud call. He tossed his phone lightly onto the soft couch cushions. He ran both of his hands forcefully through his dark hair. "Why did you not remind me?" he asked loudly, a sharp edge of genuine frustration creeping into his tired voice. You always remind me about these incredibly important family dates. I turned my head slowly, looking directly into his angry eyes. It is not my birthday to remember David, I said quietly, my voice remaining perfectly calm and steady. She is your older sister, and you are a fully capable adult. I am not your administrative assistant hired to manage your personal social calendar. He blinked several times, completely shocked by my firm tone. But you know exactly how she gets, he argued defensively, gesturing vaguely toward the silent phone. You know she will completely blame me, and she will definitely blame you for this entire messy situation. I shrugged my shoulders softly, turning my attention back to the cold pizza. She can blame me all she wants, I replied evenly. It simply does not change the plain fact that you forgot her birthday all by yourself. The tense weekend passed in heavy, uncomfortable silence. Sunday morning arrived brightly, bringing the next major test of my new quiet resolution. For the past 4 years, every single Sunday afternoon, I sent a detailed, cheerful group text message to the entire extended family. I would update his mother, Martha, and his sister, Clara, about our upcoming weekly schedule. I would arrange the exact times for casual weekly phone calls. I would organize the complex logistics for any upcoming family visits. I was the central, deeply exhausted hub of all their family communication. I sat comfortably on the back porch, drinking my hot herbal tea, watching the green leaves blow gently in the warm afternoon wind. My phone sat quietly on the small glass table next to me. I watched the digital clock slowly change from noon to 1 in the afternoon. I usually sent the long group update right after our late Sunday breakfast. I took a slow sip of my sweet chamomile tea. I intentionally left the phone lying completely untouched on the smooth glass surface. Inside the quiet house, David was deeply absorbed in watching a long football game. He had absolutely no idea about the complex communication network that was currently failing rapidly, completely without my active effort. By 3:00 in the afternoon, the natural consequences began to manifest clearly. The loud ringtone of his cell phone echoed sharply from the living room. I listened closely from my quiet spot on the porch. "Hello, Mom," David answered cheerfully, his voice carrying easily through the open screen door. There was a brief, heavy pause as he listened to his mother speak. "No," he said suddenly, his tone shifting quickly into deep confusion. "Sarah did not tell me anything about coming over for dinner tonight. We already ordered some heavy takeout and we are just relaxing at home." He listened for another long moment, pacing nervously back and forth across the hardwood floor. "I am so sorry, Mom," he apologized quickly, sounding incredibly flustered. "I honestly did not know that you were expecting us today. We can try to come by next weekend if you want to cook again." He hung up the phone quickly, walking out onto the back porch looking completely bewildered. "My mother just made a huge pot of chili," he said slowly, looking down at me in my comfortable chair. "She said she was fully expecting us to come over for a big dinner tonight." I looked up at him calmly, setting my warm mug down gently. "Did you make firm plans with her?" I asked innocently, keeping my face completely blank. "No," he replied quickly, shaking his head. "But you usually coordinate these things on Sunday mornings. You usually send the long group message to figure out the week. I did not send a message today," I stated simply, folding my hands softly in my lap. "I thought it would be much better if you managed your own family schedule directly with your own mother." David stared at me, his brow furrowed deeply, trying desperately to comprehend this sudden massive change in my behavior. "But you always do it," he repeated weakly, stating the obvious fact out loud into the quiet air. I nodded my head slowly, agreeing with his correct assessment. "I used to do it. I corrected him gently. But I am entirely stepping back now. It is incredibly exhausting trying to manage everyone perfectly all the time. The profound impact of my simple withdrawal rippled rapidly through the entire week. On Tuesday afternoon, David completely missed a planned video call with his elderly aunt because I had not placed the bright reminder directly onto his digital calendar. On Thursday evening, Clara arrived completely unannounced at our front door, expecting a formal dinner. She had simply assumed in the total absence of my weekly update that the usual open invitation was still actively standing. Clara stood firmly on the front porch, glaring angrily at my simple plate of scrambled eggs and dry toast. "You did not even bother to text me back," she complained loudly, crossing her arms tightly over her chest. "I told Mom clearly that I was coming over here tonight for a meal." I looked at her calmly standing in the wide open doorway. "I am sorry, Clara," I said politely without a single ounce of real warmth. "David is completely in charge of all the family scheduling now. You will have to speak directly with him about any future dinner plans." I gently closed the heavy wooden door right in her shocked face, leaving her standing completely alone on the dark front porch. The entire family system, built entirely upon my endless, invisible labor, was slowly fracturing right before my open eyes. They were completely lost, stumbling blindly in the dark without my constant, exhausting guidance. David spent the entire week frantically apologizing to various relatives, trying desperately to repair the broken threads of regular communication. He looked incredibly tired and deeply stressed by Friday evening. He sat at the kitchen table, rubbing his aching temples, staring blankly at his chaotic phone screen. He finally began to feel a tiny, painful fraction of the heavy mental weight that I had carried completely alone for 4 long, unappreciated years. Saturday morning arrived quiet and remarkably still. I drove slowly across town to the small, tidy house of my mother-in-law, Martha. The sprawling front yard was filled completely with blooming yellow rose bushes. Martha was 71 years old. She possessed a quiet, observant nature that was vastly different from the loud, constant demands of Clara. I parked my car carefully in the wide driveway. I walked up the cracked concrete path, holding a small white box of fresh lemon pastries. Martha opened the wooden door before I even had the chance to ring the brass bell. "Come inside, Sarah," she said warmly, offering me a gentle, welcoming smile. "It is so incredibly good to see you today." I followed her slowly into the bright sunroom located at the completely back of her cozy house. The warm room smelled faintly of old paper books and sweet jasmine tea. We sat down together on the floral-patterned cushions of her wicker sofa. Martha poured the hot tea into 2 delicate porcelain teacups. She handed one over to me, her soft, wrinkled hands moving with practiced, careful grace. She sat back comfortably, taking a slow sip of her own hot drink. She looked at me directly over the rim of her delicate cup. Her wise, dark brown eyes missed absolutely nothing. "You look incredibly tired, my dear," Martha stated softly, placing her teacup gently onto the glass table. "And David sounded completely frantic when he called me on Thursday night about the missed dinner plans." I looked down quietly at the dark tea swirling slowly in my cup. I felt a sudden massive lump form tightly in my throat. I had spent 4 entire years trying so incredibly hard to be the absolute perfect daughter-in-law. I never wanted Martha to see the ugly, stressful cracks in my marriage to her son, but I was simply too exhausted to keep up the heavy charade for 1 more minute. I took a deep, steadying breath, preparing to speak my complete truth. "I stopped doing it, Martha," I confessed quietly, looking back up into her kind eyes. "I stopped reminding him about every single appointment and every family birthday. I stopped organizing the weekly dinners and absorbing all the sharp complaints from Clara. I just cannot carry the heavy weight of his entire family schedule all by myself anymore. I waited anxiously for her predictable defensive reaction. I fully expected her to defend her only son. I braced myself tightly for a gentle reprimand about my wifely duties. Instead, Martha remained completely silent for a very long time. She reached across the small distance and placed her warm hand gently over mine. She patted my trembling fingers with a deep, profound understanding. I am honestly surprised that you managed to do it for 4 entire years, Martha said softly, her voice filled with genuine warm compassion. I watched you running around at that terrible holiday dinner, trying desperately to please everyone. I saw the cruel way my daughter spoke to you about your lovely career. I saw my son sitting right next to you looking blindly down at his phone. I felt a single hot tear slide down my left cheek. I quickly brushed it away with the back of my hand. You saw all of that? I asked her quietly, my voice barely above a whisper. Of course I saw it, Sarah, she replied gently, squeezing my cold hand. I am an old woman, but I am certainly not blind. I raised David to be a kind, responsible boy, but somewhere along the way, he became completely complacent. He allowed you to become the soft shield between himself and the difficult reality of his own sister. Martha looked out the bright window at her blooming yellow roses. Her expression turned slightly sad, completely lost in old memories. Women like us. She continued softly, we are taught from a very young age to constantly fix things. We are trained to smooth over the rough edges to keep the fragile peace at the total expense of our own sanity. I did the exact same thing for David and Clara when they were young children. I made everything perfectly easy for them. And because of my own foolish mistakes, Clara never learned basic empathy, and David never learned how to handle conflict. She turned her gaze back to my tearful face. Do not feel guilty, Sarah. Martha instructed me firmly, her voice entirely steady and strong. You are doing the absolute right thing. You are finally forcing them to face the messy consequences of their own careless actions. It will be incredibly chaotic for a little while. They will likely be very angry and deeply confused, but you must hold your ground firmly for your own sake. I sat back slowly against the soft wicker cushions. A massive heavy weight lifted entirely off my tired shoulders. I had come here today fully expecting a difficult battle. Instead, I had found a wise, quiet ally. I took a long sip of my sweet jasmine tea. The warm liquid soothed my tight throat. For the very first time in 4 long years, I truly felt seen and completely understood by someone in this family. Thank you, Martha, I said softly, feeling a genuine smile touch the corners of my mouth. We spent the rest of the peaceful afternoon quietly eating the lemon pastries, enjoying the comfortable, completely honest silence. The quiet peace of the afternoon vanished completely the exact moment I returned to our house. David was waiting for me standing firmly in the center of the warm kitchen. He looked deeply stressed and visibly agitated. Where have you been all day long? He asked sharply, crossing his arms tightly over his broad chest. I went to visit your mother, I replied calmly, setting my heavy purse down on the wooden dining chair. He ran his right hand heavily over his exhausted face. Clara has been calling me relentlessly for the entire weekend, he complained loudly, his voice echoing in the large room. She is still incredibly furious about the missed birthday and the absolute lack of a proper gift. She is demanding a formal apology from both of us immediately. I am entirely not apologizing to your older sister, I stated simply, pouring myself a tall glass of cold water. I did absolutely nothing wrong. David threw his hands up in sudden sheer frustration. "You did this on purpose. He accused me directly," his voice rising significantly in volume. "You completely set me up to fail, Sarah. You knew exactly what day it was. You looked right at the paper calendar all week long. You knew I was entirely buried in that massive corporate project. You intentionally let me forget just to actively punish me for what she said at the dinner table last Sunday." I leaned back slightly against the cool granite counter. "I did not set you up, David," I replied evenly, keeping my own emotions completely in check. "I simply stopped managing your own personal life for you. You are a 40-year-old man. You have a highly advanced digital calendar on your expensive cell phone. You manage complex million-dollar budgets at your busy engineering firm. You are perfectly capable of remembering the birth date of your own biological sister." He paced rapidly across the tiled kitchen floor. "But that is entirely different," he argued defensively, gesturing wildly with both of his hands. "My daily work is structured and highly predictable. You have always managed the complex social calendar for us. That was our quietly agreed system. We are a married partnership. We divide the daily domestic labor. You handle the complicated family events, and I handle the heavy financial planning. You completely changed the established rules without giving me a single clear warning." I took a slow, deep breath, feeling the deeply familiar exhaustion creeping rapidly back into my tired bones. "We never actually agreed to that completely unbalanced system," I corrected him gently. "I just started doing it 4 entire years ago because it was vastly easier than watching the chaotic fallout of your forgetfulness. I took over the massive mental load because you completely avoided it, and my grand reward for that massive effort is being constantly insulted by Clara while you sit right next to me in complete deafening silence." David stopped pacing abruptly. He looked genuinely confused by my blunt, unexpected honesty. "I do not sit in complete silence," he protested weakly, trying desperately to defend his own passive behavior. "I try very hard to keep the peace. You know exactly how incredibly difficult Clara can be. If I challenge her directly, she will just escalate the tense situation and make everything significantly worse for everyone involved. I am just trying to actively protect our quiet weekends. Protecting your own peaceful weekends is not the exact same thing as actively protecting your own wife," I pointed out clearly. "You allow her to disrespect my career and my hard work right inside my own kitchen. You expect me to buy her expensive gifts and plan her elaborate parties while she treats me exactly like a hired servant. And when I finally stop doing the invisible labor, you quickly accuse me of punishing you." David stared at me, his jaw clenching tightly. He was deeply uncomfortable being forced to look closely at his own glaring inaction. He felt entirely victimized by my sudden refusal to keep playing the deeply familiar toxic game. "But you are actively punishing me," he insisted stubbornly, pointing a sharp finger in my general direction. "You let me look like a completely terrible brother. You embarrassed me deeply in front of my entire extended family. You made me look completely incompetent on purpose." "I am not powerful enough to make you look incompetent," I said quietly, feeling a deep, profound sadness settling heavily over my chest. "Only your own direct actions or your deliberate inaction can actually do that. If remembering a simple birthday makes you look like a terrible brother, then perhaps you really need to evaluate your own relationship with your sister. I am completely stepping out of the middle of it." He shook his head rapidly, utterly refusing to accept my firm new boundaries. "You cannot just completely withdraw from my entire family," he demanded loudly. "We are a married couple. We must present a completely united front. You are actively tearing this family apart with this petty, silent protest." "And what about my own mother?" he asked accusingly. his voice dripping with sudden righteous indignation. "You completely blew off the Sunday dinner with my sweet mother. She cooked a massive meal for the entire family. You know she looks forward to those specific weekly gatherings. You intentionally hurt her feelings just to make a deeply selfish point." I looked at him calmly, remembering the peaceful, quiet afternoon I had just spent drinking sweet jasmine tea in her bright sunroom. "Did she actually tell you that her feelings were deeply hurt?" I asked him innocently, tilting my head slightly. "Or are you just blindly assuming that she is exactly as furious as Clara?" David scoffed loudly, rolling his dark eyes toward the ceiling. "Of course she was deeply hurt," he insisted loudly, his face turning a dark shade of red. "She called me specifically asking exactly where we were. She sounded incredibly confused and completely abandoned. It was entirely cruel of you to leave her completely in the dark about our weekend plans." "It is incredibly fascinating," I noted quietly, keeping my tone perfectly measured. "It is absolutely fascinating how quickly you notice when someone else feels confused and abandoned. It is amazing how fiercely you will quickly defend the tender feelings of your mother and your highly demanding sister. But you simply cannot seem to muster that exact same protective energy for the woman you actually married." That specific comment struck a very deep, raw nerve. He flinched visibly, taking a small, involuntary step backward. "That is entirely unfair," he countered weakly, his loud anger suddenly deflating into something that looked exactly like quiet shame. "I love you, Sarah. You know I love you deeply. I just do not understand why you are suddenly acting so cold and so incredibly distant. You are acting like a completely different person." "I am not a different person, David," I whispered softly, the heavy emotional toll of the long argument finally catching up to my tired body. "I am just the exact same woman, entirely depleted of her endless, unrewarded patience. I have poured from a completely empty cup for far too long. I am simply refusing to do it anymore. If you want a strong, functional family, you are going to have to actually help me build it." The following 2 weeks dragged by with a heavy, suffocating slowness. My firm refusal to apologize to his demanding sister Clara did not simply end the bitter conflict. It merely shifted the active battlefield from our private living room out into the much wider world of the extended family. Clara was absolutely not the type of woman who could ever tolerate being quietly ignored. If she could not completely control my direct actions, she was entirely determined to completely control the dominant narrative. She began a highly organized, relentless campaign of loud, dramatic complaints. She called every single aunt, uncle, and distant cousin in their large family directory. She spent countless hours on the phone spinning a deeply tragic tale of her own unprovoked victimization. According to her highly edited, completely false version of events, I had suddenly snapped completely out of nowhere. She told everyone who would actively listen that I was actively trying to completely isolate David from his own loving family. The painful results of her loud gossip became highly apparent very quickly. On a quiet Tuesday evening, the landline phone rang loudly in our quiet kitchen. I picked it up casually, completely unaware of the hidden trap. "Hello," I said simply, leaning against the cool granite counter. It was Aunt Susan, the oldest sister of Martha. She had always been a loud, highly opinionated woman who thrived on messy family drama. "Sarah, dear," Aunt Susan began slowly, her voice dripping with false, sugary sweetness. "I was just calling to check on you because Clara mentioned you were going through a very difficult mental phase." I gripped the plastic receiver tightly until my knuckles turned white. "A difficult mental phase," I repeated flatly, staring blankly at the clean kitchen wall. "Yes, dear." Aunt Susan continued, quickly adopting a deeply patronizing tone. She said you are acting incredibly hostile toward everyone in the core family lately. She said you completely ruined her birthday out of pure childish spite. Now, Sarah, you know a good wife must always support her husband and gracefully embrace his entire family. You really must try harder to keep the sweet peace for the sake of poor David. I took a slow, deep breath, counting silently to 5. I realized in that exact crystal clear moment how completely, entirely useless it was to fiercely defend my own character. Clara had already successfully planted her deeply toxic seeds of doubt. "Thank you for your deep concern, Aunt Susan," I replied calmly, keeping my voice perfectly even and entirely polite. But Clara and David simply experienced a minor miscommunication regarding her specific birth date. I am perfectly fine, and my mental health is completely excellent. I quickly ended the frustrating call, placing the receiver down softly before she could offer any more unsolicited marital advice. When David came home that evening, he looked even more exhausted than he had the entire previous week. He threw his heavy metal keys loudly onto the glass entryway table. "Uncle Robert called me at the busy office today," David announced, bitterly aggressively, loosening his tight silk collar. He spent 45 minutes lecturing me loudly about properly controlling my own wife. He said you are tearing the family completely apart and that I need to strictly force you to make a formal apology to Clara immediately. David paced nervously back and forth across the woven living room rug. "We are rapidly becoming absolute social outcasts," he complained loudly, waving his hands frantically in the air. "Everyone truly thinks you are completely unstable, and they think I am completely weak for allowing you to behave this way. You have to fix this entire mess, Sarah. You have to call her right now and just offer a simple apology so this entire agonizing nightmare can finally end." I sat quietly on the soft sofa, watching him unravel completely under the immense external social pressure. He was entirely willing to completely sacrifice my own personal dignity just to stop the highly uncomfortable phone calls. He did not care deeply about the actual truth. He only cared about stopping the loud noise. "I am not calling her David," I stated firmly, absolutely refusing to break my own direct gaze. "I am not going to offer an apology for a careless mistake I did not even make. If your extended family actively chooses to believe her ridiculous lies without ever speaking to me directly, then that is their own deeply unfortunate choice." Later that exact night, I opened my digital phone lying silently in the dark bedroom. I saw a new, highly public post on the social media page of Clara. It was a long, highly dramatic paragraph written to gather massive attention. It spoke vaguely about actively removing highly toxic, deeply negative people from your peaceful life. It received dozens of sympathetic comments from various family members, offering their complete, unwavering support to her. I felt a sharp, sudden sting of profound emotional betrayal. I had spent 4 entire years cooking massive, expensive meals for these exact people. I had bought them lovely holiday gifts and remembered all their special wedding anniversaries. And yet they actively turned against me entirely without a single moment of genuine hesitation, based entirely on the loud, bitter complaints of one deeply unhappy woman. I calmly deleted the entire social application completely off my glowing phone. I gently placed the dark device onto the small wooden nightstand. David lay right next to me, breathing heavily in the dark, cool room. We were physically sharing the exact same bed, but a massive, invisible emotional canyon had opened up completely between us. The large house was entirely silent, but it was absolutely not a peaceful quiet. It was the heavy, profoundly suffocating silence of a deep, rapidly growing emotional chasm. I slowly closed my tired eyes, wondering exactly how much more heavy pressure this highly fragile marriage could actually endure before it finally shattered completely into pieces. The heavy silence in our bedroom lingered painfully for several long weeks. It stretched out endlessly right up until the fourth Thursday in the cold month of November. Thanksgiving Day had finally arrived, bringing a massive wave of mandatory family obligations. For the very first time in our entire marriage, I was absolutely not hosting the massive holiday meal. I had firmly refused to buy the heavy turkey or spend 3 entire days baking endless pumpkin pies from scratch. Instead, we were driving in complete silence across the busy town, heading straight toward the large, beautiful home of Martha. David gripped the leather steering wheel incredibly tightly, his knuckles completely white. He stared straight ahead at the busy highway traffic, entirely refusing to look in my general direction. The tense atmosphere inside the cold car was thick enough to cut with a dull knife. We finally pulled into the long, crowded driveway. The front yard of Martha was completely packed with the parked cars of various extended family members. Aunt Susan was already there along with Uncle Robert and several of the distant cousins from out of state. And, of course, the bright red sports car belonging to Clara was parked prominently near the front door. I stepped out of the cold car, pulling my heavy wool coat tightly around my shivering shoulders. I carried a simple store-bought pumpkin pie resting comfortably in my cold hands. It was the absolute only item I had agreed to bring today. David walked quickly ahead of me, eager to escape the heavy tension entirely abandoning me on the cold concrete walkway. I took a slow, deep breath, preparing my tired mind for the highly difficult hours ahead. I opened the heavy front door and stepped into the warm, crowded hallway. The massive house was completely filled with loud laughter and the rich smell of roasted turkey and savory stuffing. But the exact moment I stepped into the busy living room, the cheerful noise dropped significantly. Several heads turned sharply in my immediate direction. Aunt Susan stopped talking mid-sentence, staring openly at me with highly critical, judging eyes. Uncle Robert coughed awkwardly quickly, looking down at his dark, polished shoes. The incredibly heavy tension in the room was absolutely palpable. It hung heavily in the warm air, pressing down painfully on my tired shoulders. I walked slowly past the staring relatives, heading straight toward the busy kitchen, desperately seeking the quiet comfort of Martha. Clara was standing right in the center of the large living room, holding a tall glass of sparkling wine. She wore a bright, incredibly expensive-looking red dress. She looked directly at me, a thin, highly triumphant smile playing slowly across her brightly painted lips. She did not say a single word of polite greeting. She simply turned her back, completely engaging in a loud, entirely exaggerated conversation with a distant cousin. I walked past her quietly, my head held completely high, absolutely refusing to show any public signs of weakness. I entered the warm kitchen, finding Martha standing carefully by the hot double ovens. "Hello, Sarah dear," Martha said softly, turning around with a genuine warm smile. She wiped her hands quickly on a clean white towel and stepped forward to embrace me gently. "I am so incredibly glad you decided to come today." I hugged her back tightly, feeling a brief, fleeting moment of genuine comfort. "I brought a pie," I said quietly, setting the simple white box down on the completely crowded granite counter. Martha looked at the store-bought box and then looked back at my tired face. Her wise, observant eyes understood the massive significance of that entirely simple gesture. "Thank you, my dear," she replied warmly, placing a comforting hand gently on my tense shoulder. "It is going to be a very long afternoon, so please try to stay close to me." I nodded slowly, appreciating her quiet, steady support. I poured myself a small glass of cold apple cider. I stood quietly in the corner of the busy kitchen, watching the chaotic family dynamics unfold slowly before my tired eyes. David was standing in the adjacent dining room talking loudly with Uncle Robert, trying desperately to pretend that absolutely everything was perfectly normal. But absolutely nothing was normal today. The entire family system had been completely destabilized by my quiet refusal to participate in their toxic drama. They were all tiptoeing carefully around the massive invisible elephant in the room. They were waiting anxiously for the inevitable emotional explosion. And I knew deep down with absolute terrifying certainty that Clara would absolutely not let this major holiday pass without attempting to publicly punish me for my perceived defiance. The heavy wooden dining table was beautifully set with fine china and polished silver. Martha called everyone warmly into the large formal dining room. I walked in slowly, taking my assigned seat directly next to David. As fate would have it, Clara was seated entirely opposite me, directly across the wide expanse of the white lace tablecloth. The enormous roasted turkey sat heavily in the center, completely surrounded by steaming bowls of fresh vegetables and rich gravy. The heavy serving platters were passed quietly around the crowded table. In any normal year, this exact room would be filled with loud, cheerful conversations, but today the heavy tension was absolutely suffocating. The only distinct sound was the quiet metallic scraping of silver forks against porcelain plates. Aunt Susan chewed her food carefully, looking nervously back and forth between me and Clara. Uncle Robert stared completely downwards, entirely focused on his mashed potatoes. David sat rigidly beside me, eating his hot food in complete, desperate silence. He was actively praying to absolutely any higher power that this tense dinner would simply end without a massive public scene. But his desperate silent prayers were entirely useless today. Clara had a highly captive, completely attentive audience, and she was absolutely determined to use it to her full advantage. She carefully set down her silver fork, placing it neatly on the edge of her white plate. She picked up her crystal wine glass, taking a slow, deliberate sip. She looked directly across the table, locking her cold, dark eyes entirely onto mine. "I see we have a very lovely, simple store-bought pie for dessert today," Clara announced loudly, her sharp voice instantly cutting through the heavy, quiet room. The entire table went completely, utterly still. Nobody dared to take another bite or make a single sound. I kept my own eyes fixed firmly on my full plate. I did not offer her a single word of defensive response. I just took a small breath, letting the heavy, uncomfortable silence stretch out painfully over the large room. But Clara was absolutely not finished. She leaned forward slightly, resting her thin elbows right on the white lace tablecloth. "It is perfectly fine," she continued smoothly, her tone dripping with false sugary understanding. "I know Sarah has been incredibly busy lately doing her own little things. She has completely abandoned her basic core family duties to focus entirely on herself." Aunt Susan gasped softly, placing her pale hand quickly over her chest. Uncle Robert shifted heavily in his creaking wooden chair. I felt a sudden massive wave of heat rise quickly up my neck. My fingers gripped the soft linen napkin resting in my lap until my knuckles ached with dull pain. "It is just such a massive shame," Clara pressed on loudly, refusing to let the awkward moment pass. "We used to have such wonderful, highly organized, cohesive family gatherings. We were a deeply connected, loving family unit before certain people simply decided to completely stop trying. It is incredibly selfish to actively punish your own husband and completely neglect his loving mother just because you cannot handle a tiny bit of honest, constructive criticism. She looked around the quiet table, actively seeking immediate validation from the captive, staring relatives. She wanted them to nod in agreement to completely side with her in this public, highly calculated ambush. Aunt Susan offered a weak, nervous little smile, quickly looking back down at her plate. The rich brown gravy was quickly cooling on my untouched white plate. I slowly looked over toward the end of the long table where Martha sat completely still. Her wise, gentle eyes were filled with a deep, profound sadness. She did not intervene immediately, knowing deeply that this specific battle belonged entirely to me and David. She watched quietly, waiting to see exactly what her only son would do. Clara took another slow, highly theatrical sip of her sparkling wine. "I honestly feel incredibly sorry for you, David," she stated loudly, turning her full attention directly toward my terrified husband. "You work so incredibly hard at your highly demanding engineering firm. You provide a beautiful, expensive home, and you come home every single night to a deeply bitter, totally unsupportive partner. It is absolutely heartbreaking to watch you suffer quietly entirely because of her deep, unprovoked resentment." The sheer cruelty of her exact words hung heavily in the warm air like a thick, toxic smoke. I felt the sharp physical sting of a deeply unfair accusation. I had spent 4 entire years cooking every single meal, cleaning every single dish, and buying every single gift for this exact woman. And now, because I had simply stopped doing her endless emotional labor, I was loudly branded as a terrible, abusive wife. I kept my hands resting quietly on my lap. I did not let a single hot tear fall from my wide eyes. I absolutely refused to give her the immediate satisfaction of seeing me completely broken. I just sat there perfectly still, breathing slowly through my nose, absorbing the heavy, ugly blow. I slowly turned my face, looking directly at David, waiting completely silently for his necessary response. David cleared his throat loudly and awkwardly into the completely silent dining room. His face was entirely flushed, turning a deep, uncomfortable shade of red. He looked around the large table with wide, panicked eyes, completely desperate to break the suffocating tension. He picked up his crystal water glass, taking a very fast, nervous sip. He set the heavy glass down, causing a loud, sharp clink against the white porcelain plate. "Come on now, Clara," David said softly, forcing a weak, completely unnatural laugh. His voice shook slightly, betraying his deep internal panic. "There is absolutely no reason to talk like that today. We are all just trying to have a very nice, peaceful holiday dinner. Let us just pass the warm rolls and try to enjoy the delicious turkey that Mom worked so incredibly hard to prepare." He reached his trembling hand forward, blindly grabbing the small silver bread basket. He offered it quickly, directly toward his angry sister, exactly like a white flag of surrender. He did not look at me. He completely avoided my direct gaze, staring intensely at the untouched food on his plate. He wanted desperately to simply sweep her cruel insults entirely under the large figurative rug. He was actively praying that changing the subject would magically erase the heavy insult hanging in the warm room. Clara did not take the offered bread. She crossed her thin arms tightly over her red dress, her dark eyes flashing with pure defiance. "I am just stating the completely obvious facts, David," she replied sharply, entirely ignoring his pathetic attempt at sudden peacemaking. "Someone has to be completely honest about what is actually happening to this family. You are completely exhausted, and she is acting like a spoiled, petulant child." The heavy word "child" echoed loudly against the high plaster ceiling. I felt a cold, deep numbness spreading rapidly through my chest. I waited for David to finally draw a firm line. I waited for him to stand up straight and demand absolute respect for his chosen wife. I waited for him to simply say that her behavior was entirely unacceptable and completely inappropriate for a family gathering. Instead, David slowly lowered the silver basket. He let out a long, deeply exhausted sigh, running a nervous hand through his dark hair. "Look, Clara," he mumbled quietly, his voice dropping to a pathetic, submissive whisper. "I know you are still very upset about the missed birthday last month. I understand exactly why your feelings are deeply hurt. Sarah has just been very stressed lately with her community work, and she dropped the ball on the family schedule." He threw me completely and utterly under the massive, heavy bus. He validated her completely irrational anger directly in front of the entire staring family. He publicly blamed my demanding career for his own completely careless forgetfulness. He actively chose in that highly critical moment to sacrifice my own dignity just to gently soothe his angry sister. He fed me directly to the wolves simply to save his own skin. Aunt Susan nodded her gray head in complete solemn agreement. Uncle Robert finally looked up, offering David a deeply sympathetic, completely misplaced look of pity. They all fully accepted his weak, completely fabricated excuse. They all firmly believed that my busy career and my selfish nature were the root cause of the entire family conflict. They nodded along, completely comfortable with the easy lie. David finally turned his head, looking nervously in my direction. He gave me a silent, pleading look, begging me quietly to just accept the heavy blame. He wanted me to lower my head, completely absorb the public humiliation, and keep the fragile peace exactly as I had done for 4 long years. He truly believed that this was the most logical, practical solution to survive the awkward holiday dinner. He wanted me to just swallow my pride one more painful time. The profound depth of his absolute cowardice was entirely breathtaking. It was not a grand dramatic betrayal. It was a small, deeply pathetic surrender born entirely of complete emotional laziness. He simply did not possess the strong spine required to confront the toxic dysfunction of his own difficult family. He would rather watch me be entirely destroyed at the dinner table than experience a single moment of uncomfortable conflict with Clara. I sat perfectly still in my rigid wooden chair. The cold numbness in my chest slowly vanished entirely. It was rapidly replaced by a sudden, incredibly sharp clarity. The heavy fog of confusion and the deep, persistent guilt completely lifted from my tired mind. I saw the entire situation with absolute terrifying precision. I was sitting at a crowded table, completely surrounded by people, but I was entirely alone. I looked at David, seeing him clearly, perhaps for the very first time. I saw a deeply frightened 40-year-old man completely controlled by the loud demands of his older sister. I realized in that quiet, devastating second that my absolute silence was no longer protecting my marriage. My endless, polite silence was actively destroying my own soul. It was slowly eating away at my basic self-worth, leaving me completely hollow inside. The large dining room remained incredibly quiet, waiting for my expected submissive apology. Clara watched me intently, a highly victorious smirk playing softly on her brightly painted face. Aunt Susan watched me carefully, waiting for me to appropriately fold under the immense social pressure. David watched me anxiously, silently pleading for my complete, immediate compliance. They all completely expected me to gently apologize and assume the heavy burden of their shared dysfunction. I slowly placed my hands flat down on the white lace tablecloth. The white fabric felt slightly rough against my cold palms. I looked directly at David, holding his fearful gaze for a long, heavy moment. I saw the exact second that complete panic finally registered in his dark eyes. He realized instantly that I was absolutely not going to apologize. He realized far too late that the deeply familiar script had been completely torn to shreds. I slowly pushed my heavy wooden chair slightly back from the large table. The sharp scraping sound echoed loudly across the completely quiet room. I did not stand up abruptly. I simply sat perfectly straight, rolling my tired shoulders back, opening my tight chest fully to the tense air. I looked directly across the wide table past the steaming bowl of mashed potatoes, entirely ignoring the highly victorious smirk still resting comfortably on the painted face of Clara. I focused my clear eyes completely on my fearful husband. "No, David," I said clearly, my voice carrying easily across the heavy silence. "I am absolutely not too stressed with my regional community work. My highly demanding career has absolutely nothing to do with the deeply embarrassing fact that you simply forgot the birthday of your own older sister. I did not drop the heavy ball on the complex family schedule. I intentionally handed the heavy ball directly back to you because it was absolutely your responsibility in the very first place." Aunt Susan gasped loudly again, dropping her silver fork completely onto her white porcelain plate. Uncle Robert raised his gray eyebrows, entirely shocked by my sudden blunt honesty. David opened his mouth quickly, desperately trying to interrupt my calm words, desperately wanting to stop the heavy truth from spilling completely out. "Sarah, please," he whispered frantically, reaching his shaking hand out toward my cold arm. "Let us just talk about this privately when we get back home tonight." I gently pulled my arm away, completely out of his nervous reach. "We have tried to talk privately for 4 entire years, David," I replied softly, shaking my head slowly, "and every single time we speak privately, you promise me faithfully that things will eventually change. You promise me that you will finally speak up and firmly defend our marriage. But exactly when the difficult moment arrives, when the actual tension rises in the room, you always choose the absolute path of least emotional resistance. You always choose to let me bleed simply so you can remain perfectly comfortable." I turned my head slowly, looking directly into the dark, angry eyes of Clara. Her thin, victorious smile had completely vanished rapidly, replaced by a deeply furious scowl. She opened her mouth to speak, but I simply raised my right hand, stopping her completely in her tracks. "I am currently speaking, Clara," I stated firmly, my tone completely devoid of any anger but heavy with absolute authority. "You have spoken loudly for the entire afternoon. It is finally my turn to share the exact truth of this deeply broken family." I placed my cold hands flat on the white lace tablecloth again. For 4 entire years, I continued clearly scanning the shocked faces of the silent relatives. I have carefully managed every single detail of this extended family. I have planned the massive holiday dinners. I have bought the expensive, thoughtful gifts for every single wedding anniversary. I have sent the cheerful weekly text messages, ensuring everyone stayed deeply connected. I did absolutely all of the heavy, invisible labor entirely behind the quiet scenes. I looked back at Clara, entirely refusing to back down. And every single time we gathered, you found a new creative way to actively insult my career, criticize my cooking, or deeply belittle my basic character. And every single time I politely swallowed my own deep hurt because I foolishly believed that keeping the fragile peace was the absolute right thing to do. I truly believed that if I just loved this family hard enough, you would eventually learn to show me a tiny fraction of basic human respect. I paused for a brief moment, taking a slow, steadying breath. The massive dining room was so incredibly quiet that I could actually hear the soft ticking of the old grandfather clock standing in the wide hallway. But I was entirely wrong, I said softly, the deep sadness returning briefly to my steady voice. My endless patience did not teach you how to respect me. It simply taught you that you could treat me terribly without facing a single uncomfortable consequence. It taught David that he never actually had to step up and manage his own difficult relationships. I looked at Martha sitting quietly at the head of the long table. A single quiet tear was slowly sliding down her wrinkled cheek. She offered me a very small, deeply encouraging nod, completely validating my heavy words. I turned my attention entirely back to my husband. The deep panic in his eyes had finally shifted, turning into complete, utter devastation. He was finally hearing the exact painful reality of what his complete inaction had cost me. I am entirely done being the emotional buffer for this deeply dysfunctional family, I announced, clearly, my voice ringing with absolute finality. I am completely done absorbing the sharp blows that are meant entirely for you, David. If Clara is deeply upset about a missed birthday, she can be completely furious with you directly. If Aunt Susan is deeply confused about dinner plans, she can call you directly and ask for the exact schedule. I am officially resigning from my unpaid, completely unappreciated position as your personal family manager. Clara let out a loud, completely, entirely bitter laugh, tossing her dark hair back. This is absolutely ridiculous, she sneered loudly, pointing a thin finger exactly at me. You are just acting incredibly deeply selfish, and you are trying desperately to make everyone else look bad to cover up your own massive failures. You are completely ruining Thanksgiving for everyone sitting at this lovely table. I did not raise my voice to meet her loud, chaotic energy. I simply looked at her perfectly calmly, completely, entirely unbothered by her desperate attempt to regain control. I did not ruin this holiday, Clara, I replied evenly, my voice remaining entirely soft, but absolutely firm. The heavy truth ruined it. The completely, entirely undeniable truth that this entire family relies entirely on my silent suffering to function properly. And the exact moment I stopped suffering in complete silence, the entire broken system collapsed completely upon itself. The entire dining room fell completely and entirely silent. Not a single person dared to take a breath. The heavy, suffocating weight of my completely honest words hung motionless in the warm air. Aunt Susan stared at me with wide, deeply terrified eyes. Uncle Robert kept his head bowed, staring blankly at the white lace tablecloth. Clara sat perfectly frozen, her brightly painted lips slightly parted in sheer shock. For the very first time in 4 long years, she had absolutely nothing to say. I had completely stripped away her false narrative and exposed the deeply ugly truth directly to the cold light. I looked down slowly at my own hands. They were trembling, slightly vibrating with a massive surge of raw adrenaline. But my tired heart was beating with a steady, incredibly strong rhythm. I did not feel a single ounce of heavy regret. I slowly pushed my heavy wooden chair completely away from the large table. I stood up tall, feeling my tired legs suddenly finding a new solid strength. I smoothed the soft fabric of my dark dress. I did not rush. I absolutely refused to look like I was running away from a chaotic fight. David looked up at me, his dark eyes filled entirely with complete and utter devastation. Sarah, please, he whispered softly, his voice cracking painfully. Please do not leave the table right now. I looked down at him, feeling a strange, profound sense of calm washing completely over me. I have said absolutely everything that I needed to say, David. I replied quietly, keeping my voice perfectly steady. I am going to go home now. You should stay here and finish the holiday dinner with your own family. I turned my head, slowly looking directly toward the head of the long table. Martha was watching me closely, her wise eyes filled with a deep, quiet respect. She did not look angry. She did not look deeply disappointed. She gave me one final, incredibly slow nod of her gray head. It was a silent, powerful permission to completely walk away from the heavy, toxic burden. Thank you for the lovely dinner, Martha, I said warmly, offering her a genuine soft smile. I will call you next week. I turned my back completely on the frozen, staring relatives. I walked slowly and deliberately out of the large, formal dining room. I stepped into the wide, quiet hallway. The loud, chaotic energy of the tense dinner table completely faded away behind me. I reached into the hall closet, pulling out my heavy wool coat. I slipped my cold arms into the warm, dark sleeves. I pulled my cell phone from my deep pocket, quickly ordering a private car service to take me directly home. I stepped out the heavy front door into the crisp, freezing November air. The cold wind hit my flushed face, feeling incredibly sharp and wonderfully refreshing. I stood entirely alone on the dark front porch, waiting quietly for my ride to arrive. A massive, overwhelming wave of sheer emotional exhaustion suddenly crashed completely over me. My tense shoulders dropped heavily. The raw adrenaline began to slowly fade away, leaving me feeling completely hollow and deeply exposed. I had just completely blown up my entire married life. I had publicly humiliated my husband directly in front of his entire extended family. I had deeply insulted his sister and completely shattered the fragile, deeply familiar peace. I felt incredibly vulnerable, standing completely alone in the dark. But beneath the heavy, terrifying fear, a completely different feeling was slowly beginning to bloom. It was a deep, profound, incredibly beautiful sense of total relief. A dark car pulled slowly into the crowded driveway. I climbed quietly into the warm back seat. The quiet driver asked me for my exact destination. I gave him the familiar address of my dark, empty house. I leaned my tired head back against the cold leather seat. I closed my heavy eyes, listening to the soft hum of the spinning tires against the dark asphalt. For 4 entire years, I had constantly worried about exactly what other people were feeling. I had actively sacrificed my own comfort to keep everyone else completely happy. Tonight, for the very first time, I was entirely alone and perfectly fine with it. I arrived back at the dark, quiet house exactly 20 minutes later. I unlocked the heavy front door, stepping into the completely silent foyer. The large house felt completely empty, entirely devoid of the usual heavy tension. I did not turn on a single light. I simply dropped my heavy purse onto the glass table. I walked slowly through the dark kitchen, heading straight toward the wooden back door. I stepped out onto the cold wooden back porch. The dark night sky was completely clear, filled with bright shining stars. I sat down heavily on the cold porch step, wrapping my warm coat tightly around my shivering body. I did not know exactly what was going to happen tomorrow. I did not know if my fragile marriage could actually survive this massive emotional earthquake. But I knew exactly, with absolute unwavering certainty, that I would absolutely never go back to being the silent, invisible sacrifice. I breathed in the cold, fresh air, waiting patiently in the complete darkness for my husband to finally come home. I sat in the dark for over 2 entire hours. The freezing November wind bit sharply at my exposed cheeks. I watched the bright silver moon rise slowly over the tall, bare oak trees. The surrounding suburban neighborhood was completely and entirely silent. Almost everyone was safely inside, completely tucked away in their warm, brightly lit houses, digesting their massive holiday meals. I pulled my heavy wool coat tightly around my shivering shoulders, absolutely refusing to go inside. I needed the sharp, freezing air to keep my tired mind completely alert and entirely clear. At exactly 10:15, I finally saw the bright, sweeping headlights of his dark sedan turn slowly onto our quiet street. I watched him pull heavily into the wide concrete driveway. The loud car engine cut off completely, plunging the dark yard right back into absolute stillness. I heard the heavy car door slam shut with a loud metallic thud. I heard his slow, incredibly dragging footsteps walking heavily up the front concrete path. The sharp click of his heavy brass key turning in the front door lock echoed loudly through the completely silent house. I did not move a single freezing muscle. I simply waited patiently on the dark wooden back porch. I heard him walking slowly through the dark, empty rooms. He did not turn on a single overhead light. He moved exactly like a man who was completely lost inside his very own home. He walked slowly into the dark kitchen, his heavy leather shoes tapping softly against the smooth tile. The heavy wooden back door finally creaked open directly behind my freezing back. He stepped out slowly onto the cold wooden planks. He did not say a single defensive word for a very long time. He simply stood there, lingering in the deep, freezing shadows, breathing heavily into the cold night air. I did not turn my head to look at his tired face. I kept my eyes fixed firmly on the dark, empty backyard. Finally, I felt the cold wooden steps creak heavily under his shifting weight. He sat down slowly right next to me on the top porch step. He kept a wide, incredibly careful distance completely between us. He leaned forward heavily, resting his tired elbows entirely on the knees of his dark dress pants. He let his heavy head hang completely down, staring blankly at his polished shoes. The thick, oppressive tension that usually accompanied his physical presence was entirely gone. It was completely replaced by a profound, deeply sorrowful exhaustion. He looked incredibly small, sitting there in the cold silver moonlight. He looked exactly like a man who had finally dropped a massive crushing weight only to realize his own hands were entirely bruised and broken. We sat together in absolute heavy silence for what felt like an eternity. I did not feel the urgent, deeply familiar need to quickly fill the quiet space with soft, comforting words. I did not reach my warm hand out to gently rub his shivering arm. I simply allowed him to sit completely alone in his own deeply uncomfortable silence. I needed him to feel the absolute freezing coldness of the massive emotional chasm he had actively helped to create. "I am so incredibly cold," David whispered finally, his voice barely audible over the gentle rustling of the dry winter leaves. "It is late November, David," I replied simply, keeping my tone perfectly neutral and entirely calm. "The nights are always very cold at this specific time of year." He slowly lifted his heavy head, looking out blindly into the dark, empty yard. "I did not mean the actual weather, Sarah," he said quietly, his voice breaking slightly on the soft sound of my actual name. I feel completely cold inside my own chest. I feel entirely, utterly empty." I slowly turned my head, looking directly at his pale, exhausted profile. The bright moonlight fully illuminated the deep, dark circles heavily bagging under his sad eyes. He had completely forgotten to grab his own warm winter coat in his frantic, desperate rush to finally leave the disastrous dinner. He was shivering violently in his thin white dress shirt, but he made absolutely no move to go back inside the warm house. The rest of the holiday dinner must have been completely miserable. I stated softly, offering him a simple, undeniable fact without a single trace of judgment. It was completely unbearable, he confessed quietly, running his trembling, cold hands over his frozen face. The exact moment you walked out that front door, the entire house went absolutely dead. Clara started loudly screaming, saying you were entirely unhinged and completely deeply selfish. Aunt Susan started crying loudly into her cloth napkin. He swallowed hard, staring blankly ahead. And my mother, he continued softly, his voice trembling with deep, raw emotion. My sweet mother just stood up slowly, completely ignored the screaming of Clara, and walked entirely away into her own quiet bedroom. She locked her heavy wooden door, and she absolutely refused to come out for the rest of the entire afternoon. I just sat there entirely alone at the massive dining table. David whispered, a single hot tear finally sliding down his cold cheek. I sat completely alone with Clara screaming directly at me, and I finally realized something absolutely terrifying. I realized that you were entirely right. You were completely right about absolutely everything. I sat perfectly still, listening to his heavy confession floating softly in the cold air. I did not rush quickly to offer him an easy, comfortable absolution. I did not tell him that everything was going to be perfectly fine. I simply let his heavy words hang completely out there in the dark, freezing night. It is a very terrifying thing, I said quietly, to finally open your eyes and clearly see the exact monster living right inside your own house. He nodded his head slowly, agreeing with me entirely. I just sat at that table, he continued softly, his voice trembling with deep, raw shame. I watched her completely ruin the holiday without a single ounce of regret. She was completely thriving on the loud, chaotic drama, and I realized suddenly that she has been doing this exact same thing to you specifically for 4 entire years. She has been actively cutting you down piece by tiny piece, right directly in front of my own blind eyes. And you never stopped her. I reminded him softly, stating the simple, undeniable fact without a single trace of bitter anger. I never stopped her. He agreed completely, his shoulders sagging heavily under the massive weight of his own profound guilt. I was so incredibly terrified of becoming the direct target of her relentless screaming rage. I just wanted to keep the fragile peace. I told myself completely false stories to justify my own cowardice. I told myself that you were incredibly strong. I told myself that you did not actually mind doing all the heavy emotional lifting. I entirely convinced myself that it was just the normal way our family operated. It was only normal for you, David, I explained quietly, looking directly at his sad, tired profile. It was completely comfortable for you because I was the one actively absorbing all the heavy, sharp blows. I was your perfect, silent human shield. Every single time she insulted me and you completely ignored it, a tiny piece of my own love for you quietly died inside my tired chest. Every single time I asked you to speak up and you offered me weak, pathetic excuses, the heavy distance between us grew significantly wider. He finally turned his head, looking directly into my cold, tired eyes. I am so incredibly sorry, Sarah, he whispered desperately, his dark eyes brimming fully with heavy, unshed tears. He did not say the word but. He did not offer a single pathetic excuse for his deeply flawed behavior. He did not quickly try to somehow shift the heavy blame completely back onto my tired shoulders. He simply sat there completely broken and entirely open, finally facing the massive damage he had actively caused. I was entirely drowning David, I told him honestly, letting my own deep, profound vulnerability show completely in the cold moonlight. I was drowning entirely in my own quiet, desperate home. I felt completely invisible to you. I felt entirely worthless. I truly believed that if I just tried incredibly harder, if I just made everything absolutely perfect, you would eventually stand up and finally fiercely protect me. But you never actually did. You let me drown quietly just so you did not have to rock the fragile, broken boat. He reached his trembling hand out very slowly through the freezing air. He did not try to forcefully grab my arm or completely pull me into a sudden demanding hug. He simply laid his cold, shaking palm completely flat on the wooden porch step, resting it gently right next to my own frozen shoe. It was a very small, deeply respectful gesture, silently asking for my complete permission to simply be near me. I did not pull my foot away. I just looked down at his trembling, cold hand. "I see the immense pain now," he said quietly, his voice breaking entirely with complete and utter sorrow. "I see exactly how much my complete silence actively hurt you. I see the heavy, invisible burden you carried completely alone for 4 entire years. I am so deeply ashamed of myself, Sarah. I am completely, utterly disgusted by my own pathetic weakness." He was finally listening completely without a single ounce of his usual heavy defensiveness. The thick, invisible wall that had entirely separated us for 4 long years was finally crumbling down right into the cold dirt. He was no longer actively fighting me or desperately trying to protect his own fragile ego. He was completely surrendering entirely to the painful, undeniable truth of our deeply broken marriage. I took a very slow, incredibly deep breath, letting the freezing, sharp air fill my tired lungs completely. The heavy, suffocating anger that I had carried fiercely for so many long months began to slowly dissolve entirely into the dark, quiet night. I did not feel magically healed. The massive, deep wounds were still completely open and incredibly painful. But for the very first time in our entire marriage, I finally felt like I was not completely alone in trying to actively fix them. I slowly turned my body slightly on the cold wooden step, facing him more directly. I waited patiently for him to continue speaking into the dark, freezing night. "I used your incredible strength completely against you, Sarah," David said softly, his voice full of quiet, heavy regret. "When we first got married 4 entire years ago, I saw exactly how incredibly capable you were. You walked directly into this messy, chaotic family, and you just effortlessly organized absolutely everything. You remembered every single tiny detail, and you always knew exactly what to say to keep everyone perfectly happy and content." He rubbed his cold hands together fiercely, trying desperately to generate a tiny bit of physical warmth against the biting winter wind. I was so incredibly relieved, he admitted, openly staring down blankly at his trembling fingers. I was so deeply, profoundly relieved that I did not have to actively deal with them anymore. I just stepped back entirely into the comfortable shadows, and I let you carry the massive, heavy emotional load. I told myself quietly that you were just naturally better at it, but the completely honest truth is I was just entirely cowardly and profoundly lazy. I looked at him quietly, letting his completely honest words wash entirely over my tired mind. "It is vastly easier to be lazy," I pointed out gently, my voice barely a soft whisper in the cold air when someone else is constantly working themselves to the absolute bone to constantly maintain your quiet comfort. He nodded his head quickly, completely agreeing with my harsh, undeniable assessment. "You became my absolute buffer," he confessed quietly, leaning slightly closer to me, but carefully maintaining the highly respectful physical distance. "I used you completely as a soft, protective human shield against the constant, sharp demands of my sister Clara. I knew exactly how cruel she could actually be. I grew up directly with her constant biting criticisms and her loud, absolutely exhausting emotional tantrums. I absolutely hated dealing with her difficult personality, so I cowardly forced you to do it entirely instead. He paused for a long, heavy moment, taking a deep, shaky breath of the freezing night air. He looked exactly like a man who was finally coughing up a deep, poisonous venom. And it was absolutely not just my sister, he added softly, his voice dropping to a deeply sorrowful, broken whisper. I used you to completely manage my own relationship with my sweet mother. I love Martha deeply, but I have always been entirely terrible at remembering to call her regularly or making the necessary free time to simply visit her house. You made me look like a completely wonderful, highly attentive son because you always organized the elaborate Sunday dinners, and you always bought the beautiful floral arrangements with my name carefully written on the bright card. The heavy, painful truth of his complete confession hung entirely motionless in the quiet, frozen air. He was completely stripping away every single protective layer of his own carefully constructed, entirely false narrative. He was actively destroying the comfortable, familiar myth of the busy, deeply stressed husband, and he was fully admitting his own profound emotional negligence. I completely abandoned you, Sarah, he whispered desperately, his dark eyes searching my cold face, pleading silently for my complete open understanding. I entirely abandoned you to the relentless, starving wolves of my own family. I watched them slowly tear you apart piece by tiny, painful piece, and I simply looked completely away because it was vastly easier for me to ignore the obvious blood. I sacrificed your deep happiness and your basic mental health entirely on the heavy altar of my own peaceful, quiet weekends. I felt a single freezing tear slide slowly down my cold cheek. I did not bother to wipe it away with my hand. It felt incredibly validating to finally hear the absolute, unvarnished truth completely spoken aloud into the vast universe. I did not need his desperate, frantic apologies. I desperately needed his complete, total, undeniable awareness. I needed him to deeply understand the exact, precise mechanics of the massive emotional damage he had actively inflicted upon our fragile marriage. You did abandon me, David, I said quietly, my voice remaining entirely steady despite the heavy, warm tears slowly filling my tired eyes. You completely broke your silent, sacred vow to fiercely protect me from harm and to always put our marriage first above all else. You let your own sister walk straight into our completely safe home and completely disrespect the woman you explicitly chose to marry. And that profound, deep betrayal hurt significantly more than absolutely anything Clara could ever say to my face. He squeezed his dark eyes shut completely, letting a fresh, heavy wave of warm tears spill over his cold, pale cheeks. I know it does, he sobbed quietly, his broad shoulders shaking violently under his thin, completely inadequate white shirt. I know exactly what I actively did, and I am so incredibly disgusted by my own complete pathetic failure as your husband. I absolutely do not expect you to instantly forgive me tonight. I honestly do not even know if you can ever truly look at me the exact same way again, but I desperately need you to know that I finally see the entire ugly picture perfectly clearly, and I am completely, utterly, entirely sorry. I listened quietly to the desperate, sobbing apologies pouring completely out of my husband. The freezing November wind howled softly through the bare, dark branches of the tall oak trees. I did not reach my warm hand out to comfort his heavy, rolling tears. I needed him to sit entirely within the deep, profound discomfort of his own terrible choices. I waited patiently for his heavy crying to finally slow down into quiet, shuddering breaths. When he finally wiped his wet face with his cold, shaking hands, I spoke my absolute truth directly into the dark night. Apologies are incredibly easy to offer in the dark, David, I said softly, keeping my voice perfectly even. But real genuine apologies require entirely different behavior in the bright light of tomorrow. I am completely willing to try and actively rebuild this broken marriage with you. But I am absolutely not willing to ever return to the way things were before today. The old, deeply toxic system is completely permanently dead and buried in the cold ground. He looked up quickly, his wet, dark eyes searching my calm face for any small sign of hope. I will do absolutely anything he promised frantically, his voice shaking with pure, raw desperation. Just tell me exactly what you need me to do, Sarah. I will change absolutely everything. I took a very slow, incredibly deep breath of the crisp, freezing air. I am completely done with your sister, Clara, I stated firmly, laying down the very first massive emotional boundary. I will absolutely not host her inside my own quiet home ever again. She is completely barred from stepping a single foot across our front threshold until she can offer me a genuine, completely unprompted apology for 4 entire years of direct, intentional cruelty. And honestly, David knowing exactly who she is, I absolutely do not expect that apology to ever actually arrive. He nodded his head rapidly, completely accepting the heavy term without a single moment of hesitation. I entirely understand, he agreed quickly, his breath forming small white clouds in the freezing air. I will absolutely not allow her to come over to our house anymore. It is your completely safe sanctuary. I am completely serious, David. I continued, evenly maintaining my intense direct eye contact in the silver moonlight. I will never buy her another expensive birthday gift. I will never send her a cheerful text message to ask about her busy day. I will absolutely not sit silently at a crowded dinner table and allow her to carelessly insult my regional career or my basic human character. If we happen to be at the exact same extended family event and she speaks to me with any level of disrespect, I will completely turn around and I will walk immediately out the door. I will absolutely not cause a loud, dramatic scene, but I absolutely will not stay and politely absorb her relentless abuse. You have absolutely every single right to walk completely away, David said softly, his voice full of quiet, newfound conviction. I will absolutely walk right out the heavy door directly behind you. I promise you that entirely. I looked at him carefully, actively evaluating the deep sincerity of his massive, heavy promise. If you truly want to save this marriage, I explained clearly, you have to actively become the absolute primary point of contact for your entire family. You are completely in charge of all their regular weekly communication. You will personally remember the important approaching birthdays. You will buy the thoughtful wrapped gifts. You will actively plan the complicated weekend visits with your sweet mother, Martha. You will completely manage their heavy emotions and their loud, endless complaints entirely by yourself. It is going to be incredibly difficult, he admitted quietly, rubbing his cold, tired face with his freezing hands. I honestly have absolutely no idea how you managed to do it all flawlessly for 4 long, exhausting years. It was entirely exhausting. I agreed softly, feeling the heavy memory of that fatigue deep in my tired bones, and it completely destroyed my own personal mental health. That is exactly why I am returning the heavy, crushing burden directly to its rightful original owner. You have to learn how to properly navigate your own highly difficult family dynamic. You have to actively learn how to set your own firm boundaries directly with Clara, because she will absolutely continue to loudly demand your complete attention and your endless blind obedience. You have to actively learn how to properly protect our quiet peace using your own strong, unwavering voice. He sat completely still on the wooden step, actively absorbing the massive, terrifying reality of his completely new daily responsibilities. He was deeply afraid of the loud, bitter conflict that was surely coming his way. But he also knew with absolute, undeniable certainty that he had entirely run out of easy, comfortable options. "I will do the incredibly hard work, Sarah," he promised quietly, his voice finally finding a steady, solid rhythm in the cold, freezing night. "I will actively shield you from her relentless, bitter toxicity. I will completely handle the scheduling with my own mother. I will finally be the strong, entirely reliable partner that you absolutely deserve to have." I simply nodded my head slowly, accepting his quiet, desperate promise, but carefully holding on to my own healthy, protective skepticism. Words were incredibly cheap, especially in the emotional aftermath of a massive family explosion. Real lasting change would require months of dedicated, completely consistent effort. Time would actually tell if he possessed the deep internal strength to completely follow through on his heavy words and actually become the man I needed. Exactly 3 entire months passed slowly and quietly since the massive, highly destructive explosion at the Thanksgiving dinner table. The heavy, cold month of February brought a bitter, freezing wind against the frosted window panes of our quiet suburban house. But inside the warm, deeply comfortable living room, the atmosphere was entirely different. A profound, entirely new sense of peaceful calm had settled deeply into the very foundation of our small family unit. It was a lazy, incredibly quiet Sunday morning. I sat comfortably on the soft gray sofa, wrapped securely in a thick woolen blanket. I held a warm ceramic mug of sweet vanilla coffee in my relaxed hands. I was reading a thick, heavy novel entirely for my own personal pleasure. For 4 entire years, my Sunday mornings were completely consumed by frantic, endless meal preparations and heavy, exhausting emotional logistics. Today, the large kitchen was entirely clean and completely quiet. David stood firmly at the large granite counter, wearing his comfortable gray sweatpants and a soft cotton shirt. He was looking intently at the glowing screen of his digital cell phone. A large, heavily marked paper planner sat completely open right next to his morning coffee. He was carefully writing down the specific dates and the complex times for his upcoming family obligations. He rubbed his tired eyes, sighing softly as he manually entered a reminder to purchase a beautiful floral arrangement for the upcoming wedding anniversary of his distant Aunt Susan. I watched him quietly over the thick top of my open book. The massive, fundamental shift in our daily household dynamic had not occurred completely overnight. The very first month after the disastrous holiday was incredibly rocky and deeply uncomfortable. David had stumbled heavily several different times. He had forgotten to call his mother back entirely on his own, and he had looked desperately toward me to quickly fix the resulting awkward misunderstanding. But I had simply remained perfectly still, kindly, but firmly reminding him that managing his own mother was completely his own responsibility. He had actually learned through incredibly painful, deeply frustrating trial and error. He had actively discovered exactly how incredibly difficult it actually was to balance the heavy, endless demands of his large, complicated family. But to his absolute genuine credit, he completely entirely stopped complaining to me about the heavy burden. He entirely stopped trying to completely pass the heavy buck back onto my rested shoulders. Suddenly, the loud, sharp ringing of his digital cell phone broke the quiet, peaceful silence of the warm room. The bright screen flashed rapidly, illuminating the dark granite counter. I did not even flinch. I did not feel the deeply familiar, highly toxic spike of sheer panicked adrenaline shooting through my tired veins. I simply took a slow, completely relaxed sip of my hot vanilla coffee. David looked down quickly at the glowing screen. His broad shoulders tensed slightly for a very brief second. "It is Clara," he said quietly, looking directly across the wide room straight into my calm eyes. In the completely old, deeply broken version of our marriage, he would have instantly handed the ringing phone directly over to me, begging me silently to completely handle her difficult mood. Today, he simply took a deep, steadying breath of the warm indoor air. He reached out with a firm hand, and he answered the loud call entirely by himself. "Hello, Clara David," answered smoothly, keeping his deep voice perfectly even and entirely neutral. I could hear the sharp, highly agitated tone of her familiar loud voice bleeding slightly through the small speaker. She was talking incredibly fast, demanding absolute attention exactly as she always did. She was loudly complaining about a complicated family brunch that she wanted to hastily organize for the very next weekend. She was entirely expecting David to completely drop all of his own personal plans and instantly commit to her sudden, chaotic schedule. David listened patiently for exactly 2 entire minutes without completely interrupting her loud rant. Then he spoke up clearly, cutting entirely through her chaotic noise. "No, Clara," he stated firmly, absolutely refusing to leave any completely open room for a messy negotiation. "Sarah and I already have firm personal plans for the upcoming weekend. We will absolutely not be able to attend your sudden family brunch." The loud voice on the other end spiked immediately in sheer, complete outrage. Clara was deeply offended by the highly unexpected, completely firm rejection. She demanded to know exactly what our highly important plans actually were. She accused him loudly of actively avoiding the core family and completely prioritizing his wife over his own biological sister. David did not offer her a single completely fabricated excuse. He did not desperately try to softly justify his firm decision or completely soothe her highly bruised ego. "Our personal weekend plans are entirely our own business," he replied smoothly, maintaining his absolute steady composure. "I hope you have a very lovely brunch. I will call you next Tuesday to simply catch up." He pulled the dark phone completely away from his ear while she was absolutely still complaining loudly. He pressed the red button, completely ending the frustrating call with a single highly decisive motion. He placed the quiet device gently back onto the smooth granite counter. He let out a long, heavy sigh of complete exhausted relief. He ran a strong hand through his dark hair, and then he looked directly at me. "That went exactly as terribly as I actively expected it to go," he admitted quietly, offering me a small, deeply tired smile. "She is incredibly furious that we are absolutely not coming over. She will definitely call Aunt Susan today to loudly complain about my completely terrible behavior." "Are you completely okay with her being highly angry at you?" I asked him softly, setting my heavy book down onto the soft gray cushions. "I am entirely okay with it," he answered honestly, walking slowly across the quiet room to sit gently beside me on the warm sofa. "I would vastly prefer that she is completely furious with me directly from a wide, safe distance than have her sitting right inside this quiet house, completely disrespecting my wonderful wife." The incredibly heavy sky absolutely did not fall down simply because I finally told her no. I smiled gently, leaning my tired head softly against his strong shoulder. The completely new family dynamic was absolutely not perfect. The distant relatives still gossiped loudly entirely behind our backs. Clara was still a deeply bitter, highly toxic presence constantly hovering around the outer edges of our peaceful lives. But the massive, incredibly destructive friction was no longer actively living right inside my own warm kitchen. The heavy, invisible burden was finally sitting securely on the completely correct shoulders. My morning at the busy community center had been entirely productive and deeply fulfilling. For the very first time in 4 entire years, I was absolutely not distracted by a heavy looming sense of dark dread about an upcoming family obligation. I ran my important staff meetings with a completely clear, highly focused mind. My younger colleagues actively noticed the completely new bright energy radiating directly from my relaxed posture. I laughed freely in the bright break room, completely unburdened by the massive mental load I used to carry entirely alone. I left the large office building exactly at 4 in the afternoon. The bright golden sun was shining warmly, completely melting away the very last remnants of the cold winter chill. I drove slowly down the deeply familiar, quiet residential street, leading entirely to the cozy home of my mother-in-law, Martha. I rolled the car window completely down, letting the fresh spring breeze blow wildly through my loose hair. I parked my car easily in the wide, cracked concrete driveway. I did not bring a massive, complicated casserole or a perfectly decorated, expensive cake carefully baked from scratch. I simply brought myself and a small, loose bouquet of bright yellow daffodils I had casually picked up from the local corner market. I walked up the concrete path feeling entirely light and completely free of any heavy, dark dread. Martha was already sitting outside waiting patiently on her wooden front porch. She rested comfortably in her favorite wicker rocking chair, enjoying the gentle fading afternoon sun. She wore a soft blue knitted sweater completely matching the clear spring sky. She smiled warmly the exact moment she saw me approaching the wooden steps. I handed her the bright yellow flowers, returning her genuine loving smile. "Thank you, Sarah," she said softly, smelling the fresh sweet spring blooms. "They are absolutely beautiful and perfectly simple." I did not actually need a massive heavy roast today. I sat down gently in the empty wicker chair located right next to her. We sat together in a comfortable, deeply easy silence for several long, peaceful minutes. We simply watched the tiny neighborhood birds fluttering quickly around the large old oak trees. The profound peace of her quiet yard was a completely stark contrast to the loud, chaotic battleground her formal dining room had become on that fateful holiday afternoon. "David actually called me yesterday," Martha announced, quietly breaking the peaceful silence with her gentle, melodic voice. "He called me entirely on his own right in the middle of his highly demanding workday just to ask exactly how I was doing. He even scheduled a specific time to come over this coming Saturday and completely fix my broken back gate." I smiled softly, looking out at the lush green lawn. "I am incredibly glad to hear that, Martha," I replied honestly, keeping my voice perfectly relaxed and entirely genuine. "He is trying incredibly hard to finally step up and completely manage his own complex relationships. He is actively learning exactly how much heavy effort it takes to properly maintain a deep family connection." Martha nodded her gray head slowly, her wise dark eyes reflecting a deep, profound understanding of human nature. "It is about completely changing an entire lifetime of deeply ingrained terrible habits," she observed, quietly rocking slowly back and forth. "I completely enabled his lazy emotional behavior when he was just a young, impressionable boy. I desperately wanted to make his life completely smooth and entirely painless. And you completely enabled it when he became a fully grown husband because you wanted to be the absolute, perfect, highly accommodating wife. We both loved him entirely too much to simply let him fail. But completely failing is exactly how people actually learn to walk. I noted gently taking a slow, incredibly deep breath of the fresh spring air. By constantly catching him before he even hit the hard ground, we completely deprived him of the necessary, deeply painful opportunity to actually grow up. We made him completely weak by actively choosing to be entirely too strong. Martha reached completely across the small space, resting her soft, heavily wrinkled hand gently over my own resting hand. "You did the absolute right thing, Sarah," she told me firmly, her voice filled completely with quiet, fierce pride. "You finally broke the deeply toxic, endless cycle. You absolutely forced everyone to completely face the uncomfortable, deeply ugly reality of our own broken system. You entirely saved yourself, and you completely saved him in the exact same highly difficult process." I looked down slowly at our joined, peaceful hands, feeling a deep, profound wave of complete, emotional contentment wash entirely over my tired soul. I had spent 4 entire long years desperately searching for my true fundamental value in the endless, exhausting acts of unpaid domestic service. I had truly, deeply believed that my absolute worth was completely tied to exactly how much heavy suffering I could quietly endure for this ungrateful family. I honestly thought being a good, loving wife meant completely erasing my own personal needs, completely swallowing my own clear voice to keep the fragile, temporary peace completely intact. I know perfectly well now that I was completely fundamentally wrong. The massive, heavy house is absolutely no longer perfectly clean every single day of the week. The highly elaborate, exhausting monthly family dinners are completely gone forever. We eat simple, easy meals together, and we completely ignore the loud, dramatic phone calls from Clara and the angry, deeply confused, distant relatives. Our social circle is significantly smaller now, but it is infinitely more peaceful and completely supportive. My complex marriage to David is entirely a massive work in progress. We still have completely difficult days where the old lazy habits fiercely try to creep back into our quiet home, but it is finally built securely on a solid rock foundation of absolute truth, firm boundaries, and mutual heavy emotional effort. He completely understands now exactly what he almost entirely lost, and he actively fights every single day to ensure he never drops that heavy ball again. I leaned back completely comfortably against the soft, woven cushions of the wicker rocking chair. I closed my tired eyes slowly, listening completely to the gentle, rhythmic creaking of the old wooden porch boards. I am absolutely no longer the invisible, deeply exhausted emotional manager of this complicated, dramatic family. I am simply Sarah. I have finally found my own strong, unwavering voice, and I have firmly established my own deep, undeniable value. I will absolutely never again set myself completely on fire just to keep other toxic people entirely warm. I slowly opened my eyes, looking directly up at the bright, clear blue spring sky. I felt entirely peaceful, entirely deeply safe, and completely, wonderfully, undeniably whole. True love is not found in silent suffering or endless sacrifice to keep a fragile peace. It is discovered clearly when we speak our truth, share the heavy burdens of daily life, and set firm boundaries. Valuing yourself teaches your family how to properly value and respect you in return.